Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to give you my spoiler-free review of Scream 6. Of course, as I usually do for big movies like this, they tend to have a lot of spoilers. We're going to do another video, probably tomorrow, later on in the day, where we'll actually talk about the specific spoilers itself. But today it's just going to be spoiler-free. We're going to go over the positives, the negatives, and then give the movie a rating out of 10. As we usually do. I do have reactions to the first 4 Scream movies all on my channel. I will put a link to the playlist down below. So if you want to watch my first time watching all 4 of those films, definitely recommend it you go check it out. And I of course also have a review of the 5th Scream, which I did last year. Without further ado, let's just jump right into this review. So starting off with the positives, right off the bat, I would say this is a very entertaining film. Like at the end of the day, if you don't really care about the nitty-gritty type stuff that has to do with movies and you just want to be entertained for 2 hours, this movie's gonna give you that. It is definitely an entertaining Scream film, but to be honest, pretty much every Scream film is. This is a very solid franchise when it comes to entertainment value, which is probably why it's within the top, maybe it is the number 1. It's definitely in the top 3 most popular horror franchises out there. Probably because it's very entertaining. It's very consumable for literally anyone. Anyone can jump into these movies and have a good time. They're just those type of movies. I don't know, they're just really entertaining. To my surprise, the kills are actually pretty good. And this is the same thing I said about Scream 5, where Scream's not really known for having good kills. They're usually a little bit off screen, or they're just stabs. They're usually kind of boring. This one was mostly stabs again, unfortunately, but they were actually really good. And the ones that weren't stabs were actually pretty cool. There's nothing that creative, nothing that insane. You're not gonna beat Nightmare on Elm Street when it comes to, kills, but it still is a lot better than I feel like the Scream franchise usually has, so I appreciated it on that note. And like I said, for the gore, there actually was a decent amount of it. There was a lot of blood in this movie, probably the bloodiest Scream film we've ever seen, so I thought that was pretty cool. The characters are solid. I would actually say this is probably the best when it comes to the amount of characters in the film, because there's so many solid characters here. Obviously, you have Samantha, the main character. I don't really think she's a great character. I'd say she's probably one of the weaker characters out of all of them, but they were doing some interesting stuff with her in this film that I was a little bit interested in. I was really curious to see where it was going to go. They don't really do anything too crazy with it, but it was better than nothing, I guess. Of course, we have Jenna Ortega as Tara, and obviously she's been a big name as of recently because of Wednesday, and she was good in this film just like she was in Scream 5. I think she's one of the better characters. You had Chad, Mindy, a new character named Ethan, as well as Danny. There was Detective Bailey, he's also a new character. Kirby returned, of course, that was well known for everyone, and Gale was returning. Those are the only 2 legacy characters here. And then, of course, you had Samara Weaving as Laura. So there was a solid amount of characters here that I actually really thought were interesting and fun to watch on screen. Probably more so than even Scream 5, even though I liked a lot of the characters in Scream 5 as well. So good thing there. And obviously, characters are important because when you like them, you care about them. When you care about them, the scenes are more intense, and that's really important. There's a lot of cool meta stuff they do in this film when it comes to franchises. So obviously Scream 5, they didn't even call it Scream 5 because they were trying to be meta to the idea of requels. And that was cool in and of itself. But then this one really goes far with the concept of franchises. And they do it so well to the point where they call back to pretty much every other Scream film. This is the most any Scream film has ever called back to other films. And not in terms of like the annoying ways, which actually, no, that's not true. There's a couple tiny little things where I thought it was annoying fan service. You know the type of stuff I'm talking about if you've seen the movie. It's just like, it just makes you cringe when you see it, because it's like, okay, they're obviously trying to call back to the prior film, but it's in the most inorganic way possible. But I do like the connections to the other films in other ways, even if it's just characters talking about the events in those films. Every single one of them is referenced in some way, shape, or form, and it all plays into the plot in an important way. And I actually Really love that a lot. So that was cool. The New York City setting is great. It's just very different than the other Scream films because obviously they were all either in Woodsboro or just sort of that area. None of them really went that far outside of that. And I think that was actually one of the biggest negatives of the Scream franchise, in my opinion, is that it always stuck with that same setting and it didn't really try to do anything different. I think setting an atmosphere is way more important to films than I think most people really realize. I remember so many people seeing the whole New York City setting and they were calling it a gimmick. They were like, oh, it's stupid. It's just a gimmick. It's just trying to get you to go in there because maybe you like New York City. But I think that's actually a really important thing. Setting could change it completely. I know everyone hates Jason X, but I absolutely love Jason X because they take Jason up in space. Like, to me, that's really different and interesting. And I know this is not nearly as crazy as that, but going to a new location and a pretty big new location being a city, I thought it was going to make for a lot of more interesting sequences than what we're used to seeing, and they do utilize it kind of well. You saw in the trailer there was a couple sequences where they're like crossing from one building to another, and they utilize it very, very well. I wish they did a little bit more though. There's a couple missed opportunities there, but they do utilize certain New York City elements in a pretty interesting way that I thought was quite entertaining. And lastly, for the positives, I thought the chase scenes were pretty good in this film, and there was one in particular with Gale that I absolutely loved. I think it's one of the best chase sequences in the franchise, so definitely look out for that one. And Gale in general, I mean, look, she was never my favorite of the three main characters, even though I love Courtney Cox. Obviously, me being a huge fan of Friends, I'm going to be very much excited to see what Courtney Cox does in this role. And it's really cool to have her be kind of like the lead of the legacy characters here because, of course, she was always overshadowed by either Dewey or Sydney just by the very nature of those characters having a lot more to do. So I was excited to see what Gale could do here, and she has a couple of really cool moments that I actually really did enjoy. And on another note, Kirby as well, she was really cool in this film. Enjoyed seeing her there. Now we're going to talk about one thing that I would put in this little segment called mixed. It's not necessarily negative, but I don't think it's positive either. It's a really big aspect of Scream movies, obviously, and I don't really think it's a good thing or a bad thing. So I'm just going to mention it anyways. That's the killer reveal. I'm not going to go into specifics with the killer reveal because it's obviously spoilers and I don't want to say anything even close. I don't want to give it away in any way, shape, or form, even by saying something even slightly referencing what it could possibly be. So I'm going to be very careful with my words here. But I'll just say I don't necessarily have any positive feelings about it. I don't have any negative feelings about it. I thought it made sense. I was like, okay, that makes sense, but I wasn't like jaw dropped to the floor, shocked out of my mind, like, wow, that is insanely cool. I was just kind of like, okay, cool, I guess that makes sense, but the motivation behind it wasn't that interesting. It wasn't bad, again, it wasn't negative, it was just not a positive. And to me, these should be positives for the Scream movies. Every other killer reveal in the other films, maybe not every other, there's at least one or two I don't really care for, but most of them I thought were pretty huge, and I was like, wow, this is crazy. But this one I was like, it makes sense, but I don't really care. You know what I mean? It was fine, but I don't know. That's all I gotta say about it for now. We'll talk about that more in the spoiler video. Now with the negatives, my biggest negative of this film has got to be the number of logical flaws. And this is one that is really hard to talk about because every time I mention something like this for really any movie, you always get those people who are like, it's a movie, it's not supposed to be realistic or grounded, so it doesn't matter. I call BS. I call BS. Look, I am never one to care that much about realism in movies. Usually, a lot of the time I don't give a shit, trust me. But there's certain elements that I think should be somewhat grounded, especially in a Scream film, because Scream is known for making fun of other films. And a lot of times the films have those tropes themselves in it, right? They make fun of horror films, they make fun of slashers, but they also still have those tropes usually in them regardless. I'm fine with tropes, that's fine. But having characters getting just absolutely shredded up by a knife and then they're just fine like 2 seconds later, I just don't like that. And that's the main issue I had with the logical flaws in this, was the wounds. The amount of wounds these characters were getting in this movie was just insane, and they're just like, they play it off like it's nothing, and it just takes me out of the moment. That's the problem. It takes me out of the moment because What makes these movies very intense is just seeing the characters get in these really intense chase sequences where they're getting, they're getting chased with a knife. The knife should be impactful. It should be really impactful, because in real life, if you get stabbed with a knife, if it's in an important spot, it could kill you pretty easily, right? So I want these stabs to be impactful. The stabs just lose their impact when I feel like the characters, not everyone, there's tons of characters who get stabbed and they do die in this film. Don't get me wrong, trust me. But there was just too many times where they just didn't even flinch. You know what I mean? And I'm just like sitting there like, okay. And it's just unrealistic. Like I said, it takes me out of the moment. It makes me feel like that doesn't really make sense. And this is also something I usually don't complain about in slasher films, because it's pretty consistent in most slasher films, and that's just characters doing really dumb things. Most of the time I don't care. I really don't usually, because that exists in real life. People make dumb decisions all the time, especially when they're under stress, being chased by a killer. Of course they're going to make some dumb decisions here and there. But the problem in this film is that I feel like I was yelling at these characters for doing dumb things almost every second. And it's not just the main characters. It's also sometimes Ghostface that does some really dumb things. And I'm just sitting there like, why didn't you do this or that? Like, just what? You know what I mean? It's one of those things that I just drives me nuts, because it just takes me out of the moment. Again, it does, because how am I supposed to root for these characters or be excited if I'm assuming they're going to do the stupidest things imaginable, and that's usually what happens. It's obviously an easy way to get them into dangerous situations. If they can't write a situation around it to try to get them into trouble, they just make them do something really stupid and then they get into trouble. And I always hate that. There's a couple moments where characters actually do some really smart things and I was actually like, that was actually clever. But most of the time, I don't feel that way. And although, like I said, that's consistent for most slasher films, it's really not that consistent for Scream. I feel like Scream was one of the better franchises when it comes to character decisions. Go back to the first 4 Scream films. Sidney was always on point. I don't remember Sidney ever, most of the time, there's probably one time I could think maybe she did, but most of the time she was on point, doing exactly what she needs to do. And the only time she was getting in trouble is when Ghostface outsmarted her. That is when she was in trouble. And that's, in my opinion, a better way to write stuff, is when instead of making the characters do something stupid to get themselves in trouble, they should get in trouble by being outsmarted by someone else. The great Vince Gilligan said that once, and I always will remember that.
We don't want it to come from stupidity. Our best thought and what we wind up going with is it comes from emotion. I want the bad guy to be smart, so the good guy has to be even smarter.
I will also say the tone was kind of off at some points. Like, sometimes there would be a character like quite literally bleeding out on the floor, and then other characters were just kind of like fiddling around doing nothing, kind of like having a heart-to-heart while this character's like sitting there bleeding out. I'm just sitting there like, well, go help the person. There's also just moments where characters are way too giggly and happy when they just witnessed people dying right in front of them moments before. And I'm just like, I get they're probably desensitized to it at this point, but come on now. Like, I feel like that takes me out of the moment a little bit when you're all giggly after these terrible things just happened. And although I said before I liked Gail in this movie, I do think they underutilized her quite a bit. I think they definitely should have had her be included for just a little bit more of the film, but that's not a big deal, because I think she was still good for the part that she was in it. And the last negative I want to say is a lot of the dialogue. I'm not going to go into specifics just because, like I said, I don't want to give away anything, but there's a lot of dialogue that didn't really add up. Like, it didn't really make sense, the character saying that, because it completely goes against something that happened to these characters before, and it just made me second guess it when I'm watching it. I'm like, that doesn't really make sense, but okay. Like, it's one of those things where I don't think it's a poorly written thing, because yeah, people can make mistakes, they can say things they don't mean all the time, but it was just like a weird line of dialogue, because I'm just like, how does that make any sense? You know? All in all, I enjoyed it quite a bit though. Even with the negatives, I don't really think it took me out of the movie too much. It just made me take the movie less seriously. If you kind of shut your brain off and don't really think too much about it, you will enjoy this a lot more. And it's a slasher, so at the end of the day, you're there for the kills, you're there for the intense chase sequences, and you're gonna get that, and it's gonna be entertaining. So I'm gonna give this film an 8 out of 10, which is a good score. I don't think that's gonna knock anyone's socks off or anything like that. It's a very common score I give for movies that I just consider to be good. But do I think it was ranked that highly against the other Scream films? You'll have to find out in my Scream ranking video that I'll be posting probably within the next few days. Not sure exactly when I'll get that done, but I'll get back to you on that when I do. I will see you on my next one. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video. Peace out.